Congressmember, thanks so much for being with us here on Power and Politics.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Now, before we get into President Trump's speech, I do want to take a moment to address some reaction to your response that came from the National Republican Congressional Committee that's garnering a lot of attention. They put out a post on X, which they have since deleted, but we do have a screenshot of it. They called you an illegal immigrant and a radical. I do want to note that you have to be a U.S. citizen in order to be elected to Congress, but what do you think about their decision to come after immigration status as opposed to the points that you were making in your rebuttal?
I think they had no substantive response to my rebuttal since it concentrated on the massive cuts to Medicaid and Medicare, food stamps, Social Security, and benefits to veterans that the Trump administration is planning to make so they can hand off a major tax break to the very rich. And so they had no response to that, nor did they have a response to immigration when we said that we are all about making the border more secure, and we want that. But we also want dreamers, farm workers to be regularized, and we want families to be kept together. So as a result of that, and having no answer to those points, they dipped into calling me an illegal immigrant. Obviously, something that's false. I've been serving in the New York State legislature and in Congress for the last 28 years. And I've been a citizen for decades. So this is a dipping to the lowest point in their soul, and something that is not really just about me. This is about other people that just don't look like the Republican campaign committee. They feel that anybody that doesn't look exactly like them may be an illegal immigrant or a radical, as they said. And the only thing radical about me is that I'm not going to bend my knee to a so-called king that's now sitting in the White House.
Well, let's get back then to President Trump's address and your response specifically. First off, what was it like being in that room? That was a long speech, a lot of back and forth. And what were some of the points that you really wanted to drive home in your remarks? You talked about cuts to Medicare and Medicaid and immigration as well. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, sure. Medicaid and Medicare are so important to my district. Over 500,000, in fact, 524,000 constituents are Medicaid recipients, and about 108,000 are Medicare recipients. So out of the 780,000 people that I represent, over 600,000 of them are Medicaid and Medicare recipients. And that's a matter of life and death. When you talk about somebody's health care and their health insurance, you're talking about life and death. You're talking about diabetics. You're talking about cancer survivors. You're talking about kids with asthma. You're talking about people with renal and cardiovascular problems. That's what you're talking about. And so if you're cutting those services, you're threatening their health and their lives. And so this is so important to the district that I represent. In addition to that, food stamps, nutritional assistance, over 200,000 families, households receive them in my district. And so that's also on the chopping blocks. And this is all being perpetrated to give the very rich a handsome tax break. And this is something that's unacceptable. I highlighted that throughout the speech. I make sure that I spoke about the Bronx and the neighborhoods that I represent in the Bronx that are very vulnerable and that they need all the support they can get. And they need to have a congressman like myself fighting for them in Congress. And so I'm not going to bend the knee to Donald Trump because he's looking to do well by his rich contributors.
With a Republican majority in Congress right now, how likely is it, do you think, that these cuts will ultimately become reality? You touched on some of the impact that it could have, given that they support so many people in our communities, too.
Well, we'll look at, for example, next week when we have our debate over a continuing resolution, whether we provide that opportunity to give both Elon Musk and Donald Trump the ability to dismantle Medicaid and Medicare. I will vote against a continuing resolution, a long-term one, that will hand them off that ability and really abdicate our power of the purse, which is enshrined in the Constitution. Congress has the power of the purse. And we see how Donald Trump has ruled now through executive orders. He's not going through Congress. And by doing that, he's circumventing those people that were elected, like myself, that are the voices for those constituencies across congressional district in the entire country. So this is when I say he wants to act like a king. This is what I mean. He's ruling unilaterally through executive orders. He's not going through Congress, the legislative branch, to get things done. And unfortunately, he missed a great opportunity during that speech to bring the country together. In fact, we need that kind of effort. The country is divided. Well, he split it even further by having a very toxic, divisive speech that night.
You mentioned executive orders. One area where we've seen a lot of them already, of course, is immigration, something that you also mentioned you touched on in your remarks. How are you seeing the effects of this administration's immigration policy, those executive orders, play out in your district? I know you referenced a neighbor who was taken into custody despite being a U.S. citizen that you helped work to resolve. How did that even happen to begin with?
Well, as I said earlier, everybody wants secure borders, safer borders. We're not arguing about that. We could have that discussion across our party lines. But in fact, we also want other kinds of resolution to the immigration debate. And that is dreamers, which are young people that have been here for on the average over 20 years. They haven't broken the law. They pay their taxes. They're teachers, nurses, homeowners, business owners. They're members of our armed forces. They deserve to be regularized. Farm workers who are not going into work out of the fear that they may be scooped up and deported. And as a result of that, prices could go up at the cash register. They must also be taken care of. And of course, keeping families together is an effort that will make America stronger. When a family is divided, when a dad or a mom is taken away from their child, that family is now vulnerable. And it's probably going to be a load on government. And so we want to make sure families are kept together. And this is what we want. We want to make sure the border is safe and stronger, but we also want dreamers, farm workers, and keeping families together to be addressed. And so that I mentioned that in my rebuttal to President Trump. Apparently, he had no answer to that. And that's why the Republican Party campaign committee couldn't resist but to jump in and make a statement of the nature that they later were embarrassed and had to take down.
Since we're talking about immigration policy right now, did you happen to catch Mayor Eric Adams' testimony on Capitol Hill this week? And if so, have any thoughts on his defense of the city's sanctuary city laws?
Well, I feel that sanctuary cities are those that provide a safety net to vulnerable families. I don't think that there are places where hardened criminals are protected. In fact, a sanctuary city is one that gives a mom the ability to take her kids to school without the fear that the principal is going to call ICE on her, or a senior citizen to go to the emergency room for treatment without the fear that a nurse is going to call the authorities on her, or a woman that's a victim of domestic violence should be able to go into a precinct and make a complaint against the batterer without being deported. That's what a sanctuary city is. It's a safety net for vulnerable people. Is not a system that provides harbor or protection for hardened criminals. The laws are already on the books. If you're not here, if you're here undocumented and you commit a crime and you go to court and they find you guilty, you are deported. That's already contemplated in the law. We don't need to introduce new laws for that. A sanctuary city, what it does is protect those vulnerable families and provides a safety net for them.
In some developing news that the Trump administration announced they're pulling $400 million from Columbia University, which I believe is in your district, because they say the school did not stand up to anti-Semitism. Of course, this is all still unfolding, but what is your reaction to that big move?
This is more about Trump's war against science and academics. This is not about protecting Jewish students. I went to Columbia University and I met with many of the Jewish students there. And I think that there must be a safe environment, not just in Columbia, but in university campuses across the nation must provide a safe environment for Jewish students to go to class without harassment, without violence, without anti-Semitism. But this does not do that. There are several pieces of legislation that have been introduced, including one by myself, the Reducing Anti-Semitism on College Campuses Act, that will help us get there, to ensure that campuses, college campuses across the country are safe for Jewish students and that anti-Semitism is not allowed to show its ugly head on a campus anywhere in the country. But this does not do that. This is just another chapter of Trump's war against science and against academics.
Congressmember Adriano Espaillat, thank you so much for your time and for the conversation and breaking down your remarks from earlier this week here on Power and Politics. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.